Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of the second episode of Season 2 of Lower Decks, and this episode was much better than the previous one, much funnier, much more interesting, and with even more correct references to other Star Trek shows, which is something this show is really good at. It shows that it is made by real fans who know their stuff, and in this episode they had a literal gold mine of references to all the other Star Trek shows. And they introduced a new character of a Tamarian, which is a species that we never saw since the classic episode in TNG called Darmok, which showed the Tamarians as a species who use metaphors in their language, and so it's impossible to translate them even with a universal translator, because most of their speech is based off metaphors, which only if you know what they're talking about then you'll understand what they mean. So they had a Tamarian character who tries to speak normally so that they'll understand him, but constantly accidentally talks with his metaphors, and so that was both funny and interesting, and it brings back something from previous shows, which I always wish they do more of. They often kind of introduced a lot of interesting stuff in Star Trek and then kind of forgot all about it. So this show is actually bringing back a lot of classic ideas and classic stuff. And the Pucklets show up again as the villains, and I think they are a good fit for a cartoon villain, because you wouldn't be able to take them seriously in a serious Star Trek show, but because this one is comedy, it's fine to have dumb villains who do stupid stuff, and so it kind of fits perfectly, and we get to see the Titan again, and Riker, and we see Boimler trying to fit in, and I could really identify with his character in this episode, because I actually just started a new job myself, and it kind of stresses me out, and I'm taking notes and I'm being nervous, and so it really reminded me of myself. And so by the way, that's the reason I'm making fewer videos than usual recently, but as I'm adjusting to the new job it will become easier, and so I will be able to sleep better and have more energy, and I will still be doing videos on YouTube as well. So I'm not going anywhere, but the adjustment period was pretty tough, and so I could really identify with his character, that even though he achieved his dream and he is serving on the Titan with Riker, which is what he wanted, it's still stressing him out, and he doesn't like how most of their missions are just about phaser fights and not the classic exploration and all of that. So everything he said in this episode kind of reminds me of my own complaints about Star Trek recently, about how it just became an action schlock instead of being about something, about exploring new ideas and science fiction, and instead being just about action. So Boimler's complaints in this episode reminds me of my own complaints, and so it shows me that again the writers are self-aware of all the criticism, and it was all done in a very fun way, and so it was kind of poking fun at everything, and so I like that. And they even had a scene somewhere in this episode in which they were poking fun at their own previous mistake in the previous season. There were some scenes in which characters had the wrong number of pips on their collar, and so they actually had the scene of someone sitting and eating corn, and then a piece of corn gets stuck near his pip, and it looks like another pip, and so he removes it and says this happens sometimes, so every time you see someone with the wrong number of pips, then it's just a bit of corn. So that was both funny, and it actually explains away a previous mistake, so I loved it. And this episode also showed us the sonic showers, which we rarely see on Star Trek. I think there was only one time in the first Star Trek movie we saw it, and then in one episode of Voyager we saw B'Elanna Torres using a sonic shower, so finally they showed it here, and it looks like the one episode in Voyager, so again a great attention to detail, that everything looks correct, even if it's something small from some one episode from the entire franchise, they still get it correctly. Even though they don't even have to, because it's not the same ship, so technically it wouldn't be a big mistake to change it, and yet they were still faithful to it, and so great attention to detail. And the funny thing is how they all shower together and not seem to be worried about it, so I guess this might be a reference to other science fiction movies, such as Starship Troopers. So anyway, they go to this alien ship, which has a giant collection of precious items, and I think it was owned by someone from the same species as Kivas Fajo, the guy who kidnapped Data. So this is some other guy from the same species, and he also has a giant collection, and it was really fun to see all the little references to the entire Star Trek franchise, including all kinds of items that we saw in the other shows, such as that head that looks like Picard. I think this was made by one of the kids on Captain Picard Day, and we see that little device from the episode The Game next to him, and we even see the painting that Picard drew in the episode a matter of perspective, which had a funny scene of Data analyzing Picard's painting, which was not that impressive. And so we see the actual same painting in this collection, and I immediately recognized that painting because that was a favorite scene of mine, and I used it in a lot of parody edits and stuff, and so I immediately recognized that painting. So it's kind of funny how much of his stuff ended up in this collection. And we see statues of all kinds of aliens from TOS, and we see all kinds of famous Star Trek weapons and swords, and we even see Worf's purple space bazooka from Star Trek Insurrection, and we see a box of Picard's wine, and we see a painting of Spot, which was drawn by Data, and so a lot of things, a lot of direct references to stuff from TNG and Voyager and TOS. And I also love the ending in which Boimler got a transporter cloned, and so there are now two Boimlers, and one of them stayed on the Titan with Riker, and the other one got sent back to the Cerritos. So this is really interesting. This has the potential to play around with this idea in a good way, unlike the missed opportunity of TNG, which never really did much with that idea except that first episode with Thomas Riker, and there was one more appearance of him in Deep Space Nine, and I kind of hoping that maybe in this episode, when they talked about him, maybe they'll reveal what happened to him, because as far as we know, he's still in the Cardassian prison. They never explained what happened to him, so this was a kind of a missed opportunity that Riker never reveals what happened to his other self. But since they now did it with Boimler, they have the opportunity to actually play around with this idea later on in this series, so I'm really curious to see what they'll do. They do have this great setup that they can play with later, and so we'll now have two Boimlers, one on the Titan and one on the Cerritos. So this was a neat way to bring him back without making him a screw up, without saying that, you know, he failed on the Titan and that's why they sent him back. So this was a really nice idea in my opinion, and it set up all these interesting things for later. The only thing I didn't like is that Riker was shown to be a bit of an a-hole. Like, why would he kick the other Boimler out? And the fact that he didn't reveal what happened to his own transporter clone, like he didn't really care about what happened to his other self, and so that was a missed opportunity, I think. I really enjoyed this gold mine of references, and there was one from the animated series which I totally missed. There was a giant skeleton wearing a TOS era science uniform, and so I kept wondering what the hell is that reference to. And only after I finished the episode I kept thinking about it, and then I remembered there was an episode of the original animated show which had a copy of Spock who was a giant, and he stayed on some planet to do something, and we never knew what happened with him, and so I guess he died and that's his remains. So this is both funny, and it neatly ties up that loose end of whatever happened to that other Spock. And maybe it's also a foreshadowing of what will happen to the other Boimler, because, you know, usually in Star Trek when there are two copies of people, one of them ends up dead. Thomas Riker was an exception until Deep Space Nine, who kind of decided to put him in prison forever and never revealed what happened to him, so maybe he also died. So maybe the other Boimler who stayed on the Titan will also die at some point. And wasn't there a scene in the previous season that showed the far future in which they were talking about Boimler and he was still an ensign Boimler who got famous somehow? So wouldn't the existence of another Boimler kind of contradict that scene? So I guess maybe the other Boimler will die at some point. Maybe he will become an evil Boimler and then die. That will be interesting. And they did kind of hint at the fact that the one that goes back to the Cerritos is a slightly kinder version of him, because, you know, he's the one who kind of stepped forward and volunteered, and the other one didn't. So the other one was more selfish. So maybe it's a hint for him becoming evil later. So that also happens with transporter clones. You know, back in the original series, there was an episode when Kirk got split into two people, and one of them was good and the other evil. And technically the Riker clone was a little bit more evil because, you know, he joined the Maquis, he stole the Defiant, he shot Kira, even though he was supposedly doing it all for some greater good, but still, our Riker wouldn't have done all of that. So maybe whenever there's a transporter clone, he is slightly more evil than the real one, and so maybe they will go that way. I kind of hope they won't, because I think it will be more interesting to play with this idea of identical copies in a more serious way and not so cartoony, even though it's a cartoon. But maybe it will be more interesting to explore the actual philosophical questions about what it means if there are two copies of you, then what does that say about the soul and all of that. So it actually raises a lot of interesting questions that maybe they can explore finally, which they didn't really do in the previous Star Trek shows whenever they had a situation like this. It was just used for laughs or for drama, but not really the metaphysical, philosophical questions which such a topic can raise. So maybe they will actually play with that, and that will be more interesting. So they set up something with a lot of potential, which I hope they will explore, and this episode was really fun for me. And hopefully the show will continue to be as fun and maybe even better. So that's all I had to say about it for today. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.